Hello everyone! Welcome to yet another day in the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And in this episode we are just seeing how deeply rooted pro-terrorism, or at the very least being for some reason ridiculously nuanced in a conflict between open terrorists and an internationally recognised state, is so deep-rooted in all our public institutions. Now you might be wondering what the hell I'm talking about and why Dominic Cummings is in the title and in the thumbnail. Well, in my last video when I was going through the reaction of people in the United Kingdom on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, Dominic Cummings put this tweet out: "People like this are all over academia and Whitehall and BBC." And it was quoting this now deleted tweet from Rivka Brown, the woman who is a supporting actor at the Novara Media Clown Show. "Today should be a day of celebration for supporters of democracy and human rights worldwide. As Gazans break out of their open-air prisons and Hamas fighters cross into their colonisers' territory, the struggle for freedom is really bloodless and we shouldn't apologise for it." And this is what your average person would probably call quite mad. As you have probably seen all over the news, what this resistance fight was Palestinians being parachuted into southern towns of Israel to rape, murder, kidnap, and generally just cause absolute carnage in southern Israeli towns and also an Israeli festival. And as we went through last video, there are plenty of people in the UK who have a positive reaction from this, but now that a few days have passed, Rivka decided that she should probably walk back this celebration of the murder of babies and the rape of women, and so threw this apology out. "I've deleted this tweet. I responded too quickly and in a moment of heightened emotion. Witnessing Palestinians defy decades of oppression hardened me to the suffering of Israeli civilians, including my friends and family, and I regret that. I'm sorry. Seeing fences torn down and military bases targeted, my instinct was to show unreserved solidarity with the Palestinian resistance I knew would be demonised. Speaking to Israeli friends hiding in bunkers has reminded me it's possible to care deeply about two things at once. Being a passionate advocate of Palestine's self-determination should not preclude empathy. In fact, I think it demands it. My tweets did not express that. I want to move forward differently." Which this feels a bit like one of those apologies that an it girl has to come up with at school, saying sorry for my attitude. And I'm not being funny, if I was an Israeli friend of hers, I would probably see this as a mask slipping moment. Because this apology also just has a lie in it. Where were all the images of fences being torn down and military bases being targeted? I mean, that wasn't what was put all over Twitter. What was put all over Twitter were parachuted terrorists being brought into southern Israel and clear footage of people being shot and kidnapped. Clearly civilians, clearly not soldiers, so I don't know what you're talking about there. However, I am completely on Dominic Cummings' side about this. This woman, Rivka Brown, she is displaying the exact type of attitude we have come to expect from our civil servants, from the BBC, from Sky News, and from academia. And this video is going to go through some examples of, hey, let's be nuanced about this terrorist attack, all the way over to, wasn't that terrorist attack a great victory? So we may as well start off with the easy target. Top barristers accuse BBC of taking sides in Hamas terrorist row. Lord Polak, Lord Wolfston, Lord Panic and Jeremy Breyer KC have written to Ofcom saying the broadcaster has abandoned impartiality. The BBC is taking sides with Hamas by calling the organisation militants rather than terrorists, four leading barristers have said. Lord Polak KC, Honorary President of the Conservative Friends of Israel, Lord Wolfston of Tredegar KC, a former Minister of Justice, Lord Panic KC, a high-profile barrister who acted against the government over Brexit, and Jeremy Breyer KC have written to Ofcom, the regulator. They accuse the BBC of abandoning impartiality by refusing to use the word terrorists to describe Hamas and deliberately choosing to describe it in more sympathetic terms. And this is the thing. Hamas are a prescribed terrorist group in the UK. It is obviously not impartial to call them terrorists when they are prescribed as such, not just by the UK, though that's the one that mainly matters, but by many other Western nations and other nations all over the world. And given they have been happy to fire upon Israeli civilians, whether it's by artillery or bullets, since the year 2000, and they're clearly happy to carry on doing it in 2023, it's absolutely reasonable and completely impartial to call them terrorists. That is clearly their tactics. And the letter they sent to Ofcom has similar arguments. They say in the letter that Hamas is a terrorist organisation under British law and a prescribed organisation. The legal position in this country is that Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organisation. That is not a matter of debate or discussion, it's a matter of legal fact. As a comparison, they say that it is entirely impartial and obviously right to refer to someone as a murderer after their conviction. It does not involve the taking of sides because it is purely a factual definition, reflecting the true position of guilt established by a court of law, and it's the same thing with terrorism and Hamas. They added the question then arises, how can it be impartial, i.e. not taking sides, to describe an organisation in terms which departs from its established legal meaning and substitutes a word which refers to an organisation which is violent or aggressive but not necessarily engaged in terrorism, and not necessarily prescribed, in short, by a significantly watered down descriptor which is less legally precise. In other words, they're accusing the BBC of trying to imply that Hamas didn't do nothing. And you may be wondering, well, where's all this come from? Has the BBC openly said they are not going to use the word terrorism? And actually it turns out, as one of their senior journalists said, actually yes, we are not going to use the word terrorist. John Simpson, who has been a BBC reporter since 1970, so he's been a BBC News reporter for 53 years, had this to say on Twitter. British politicians know perfectly well why the BBC avoids the word terrorist, and over the years plenty of them have privately agreed with it. Calling someone a terrorist means you're taking sides and ceasing to treat the situation with due impartiality. The BBC's job is to place the facts before its audience and let them decide what they think, honestly and without ranting. That's why in Britain and throughout the world, nearly 500 million people watch, listen to and read us. There's always someone who would like us to rant, sorry, it's not what we do. And as you can see, there is also a read added context, the best thing that Musk has added to Twitter. In 2021, the UK government prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organisation, and BBC editorial guidelines state, due impartiality does not require absolute neutrality on every issue or detachment from fundamental democratic principles such as the rule of law. In other words, since the rule of law in the UK has prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organisation, it's okay to call them terrorists. And also, calling a prescribed terrorist group terrorists is not having a rant. That is actually, as the letter before said, reflecting reality. You are being impartial by calling them terrorists. You are clearly not being impartial by going against what British law and international law really has prescribed them as. You are taking sides with Hamas if you are calling them militant. You are undermining and watering down the evil they have done. And this is the BBC doing it. And not just the BBC, not just some low-life intern. This is an elite reporter. This is a BBC veteran. And if that wasn't bad enough, John Simpson also wrote an article for the BBC doubling down on this after people were pointing out the same thing that I was pointing out, which is you're not impartial by calling terrorists terrorists. But let's have a look at the article he wrote for the BBC. Why BBC doesn't call Hamas militants terrorist John Simpson. This is one hell of a double down, I have to say. Government ministers, newspaper columnists, ordinary people, they're all asking why the BBC doesn't say the Hamas gunmen who carried out appalling atrocities in southern Israel are terrorists. Against civilians, yes. Why are you not calling the group who carried out terrorism terrorists, John? That's a very good question. The answer goes right back to the BBC's founding principles. Terrorism is a loaded word, which people use about an outfit they disapprove of morally. It is simply not the BBC's job to tell people who to support and who to condemn, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And yes, I would agree that calling people terrorists is implying that they are the bad guys, because targeting civilians is of course always wrong, and using civilians as human shields is of course always wrong. We regularly point out that the British and other governments have condemned Hamas as terrorist organisations, but that's their business. We also run interviews with guests and quote contributors who describe Hamas as terrorists. And this is just them trying to say, see, we are impartial because we have people on who would call them terrorists and people who wouldn't. That's fine, but as we say, we're not saying that you don't let people on to call them terrorists. We're saying that you are not reflecting reality by avoiding the term in all your quote-unquote impartial reporting. The key point is that we don't say it in our voice. Our business is to present our audience with the facts and let them make up their own minds. And how is calling terrorists not reporting the facts? As it happens, of course, many people who've attacked us for not using the word terrorist have seen our pictures, heard our audio or read our stories and made up their minds on the basis of our reporting. So it's not as though we're hiding the truth in any way, in fact far from it. So then what would be the problem with using the word? If many, if not the majority of people conclude that they are terrorists from your reporting, clearly then it's impartial to use the word. Any reasonable person would be appalled by the kind of things we've seen. It's perfectly reasonable to call the instances that have occurred atrocities, or acts of terrorism maybe, because that's exactly what they are. No one could possibly defend the murder of civilians, especially children and even babies, nor attacks on innocent, peace-loving people who are attending a music festival. It's amazing how he'll write an entire article describing how Hamas are terrorists and then saying, but we don't need to call them terrorists. Because that's exactly what he's doing here. He is just using synonyms for terrorism or terrorists, but not using the word because it's quote-unquote too loaded. You know, atrocities are pretty loaded as well. Yet the cope continues. During the 50 years I've been reporting on events in the Middle East, I've seen for myself the aftermath of attacks like the one in Israel, and I've also seen the aftermath of the Israeli bomb and artillery attacks on civilian targets in Lebanon and Gaza. The horrors of things like this stay in your mind forever, but this doesn't mean that we should start saying that organisations whose supporters have carried them out is a terrorist organisation, because that would mean we are abandoning our duty to stay objective. By again, not describing a terrorist organisation, an organisation that you can call a terrorist organisation because it is a prescribed organisation and a prescribed terrorist organisation. You would be completely impartial doing that. And it's always been like that in the BBC. During World War II, BBC broadcasters were expressly told not to call the Nazis evil or wicked, even though we could and did call them the enemy. Sure, I could understand if you were saying this is why we don't call Hamas evil, that would be fine. But I would frankly be very surprised if they were never described as acts of terror by the BBC during or after the war. Above all, said the BBC document about this, there must be no room for ranting. Our tone has to be calm and collected. Calling someone terrorist is not ranting. It was hard to keep that principle going when the IRA was bombing Britain and killing innocent civilians, but we did. There was huge pressure from the government of Margaret Thatcher on the BBC and on individual reporters like me about this, especially after the Brighton bombing where she just escaped death and so many other innocent people were killed and injured. But we held the line and we still do to this day. And the thing is here is that John Simpson's actually right. There does seem to have been a bit of a quite mental editorial stance on using the word terrorist, and here's word for word what it says in the BBC News Style Guide. The word terrorist is not banned, but it could be a barrier rather than an aid to understanding. We should not use the term without attribution. So in other words, you can use the word if there is attribution, which I suppose, as John Simpson says, that they are doing that when they are saying UK government has prescribed them as a terrorist organisation. We should convey to our audience the full consequences of the act by describing what happened. We should use words which specifically describe the perpetrator, such as bomber, attacker, gunman, kidnapper, insurgent, and militant. We should not adopt other people's language as our own. Our responsibility is to remain objective and report in ways that enable our audiences to make their own assessments about who is doing what to whom, which I can only describe as a very odd stance on the matter. If you are describing an atrocity by a militant organisation against innocent civilians, that can actually just be shortened to terrorist attack. And this paragraph doesn't really explain why they can't use it. While care is needed when describing perpetrators, an action or event can be described as a terror attack or an act of terror. When we do use the term, we should strive to do so with consistency in stories we report across all our services, and in a way that does not undermine our reputation for objectivity and accuracy. It's also very important that we strive for consistency across the international and UK-facing sites. The BBC World Story uses very measured language, but a UK version does not. A user will rightly question the different approaches. Beware of paraphrasing. Well, both use the same language then, fine. Beware of paraphrasing and selective quotation, e.g. the Israeli Prime Minister said that while terrorist attacks continued, he would not back down. Putting the single word terrorist in quotes may give the impression that the BBC is sceptical about the Prime Minister's assessment of the nature of the attacks. I do love that line. I do love that line. Because what that implies is that while the BBC is supposed to be completely impartial, even when you do put the word in, but it's in quotes, they are then making the excuse of, oh, this isn't actually impartial at all, we can't have the quote there, because it makes us seem sceptical, which to be fair it does, but I can understand with all these different aspects of reporting why they would want to avoid the word terrorist. But if it is an organised group, most countries in the world are prescribing them as terrorists and they plan out terror attacks, I don't see the issue with calling them terrorists. Domestically, we tread a similar line on Northern Ireland. The IRA is so well known worldwide that a label is not necessary. So now we don't need to use the terrorist word because everyone knows they're already terrorists. Groups such as the Real IRA and Continuity IRA can often be labelled as dissident. A second reference to organisations such as the UFF and the UVF could be along the lines of the Loyalist Paramilitary Organisation warned. So this is all well and good. It's the BBC's stance in it, I don't particularly agree with it. But obviously when BBC News reporters are out there on Twitter, they put their own personal opinions out, and here are a couple of John Simpson's. Love the news that the bloke who confronted the terrorist at London Bridge shouted, "F you, I'm Millwall, talk about counter-terror." And there is, of course, another one. French media debating not publishing terrorist names. I think the best way to beat them is to change the way we do things as little as possible. So that is two examples of John Simpson calling two separate terrorist incidents, and calling the perpetrators terrorists. Now, naturally there is a difference between putting your own opinion out on Twitter and writing articles for the BBC. However, it's clear that he is happy to call terrorists, and, well, there could be many reasons for this. If you have a look through John's recent tweets ever since Hamas committed their terrorist attacks, you will notice that John has never described the attacks he has witnessed as terrorism. In fact, he's not commented at all on them on his own personal account, and as I say, there's many innocent reasons why that might be the case. It just seems odd that in the past he's commented on his personal Twitter account of terrorist events, but not in this case. And it's similar for all the other people on the BBC, the big names, who have been happy to describe other things of terrorism in the past, but for some reason don't ever call Hamas terrorists, despite the fact that they are a prescribed terrorist organisation. It just seems odd to me that there'd be all these thoughts and prayers posts made, say post the Manchester bombing and things like that, and yet a lot of BBC reporters and people who work at the BBC, they're strangely quiet about this whole Hamas-Israel thing. Gary Lineker, for example, has only retweeted the Rest is Politics podcast because he owns the production company that produces the podcast. It's just strangely quiet, that's all I'm saying. The BBC are typically quite good at stopping the partiality of their staff from being shown out into the open. So while Dominic Cummings is probably right about what he said, there's much better examples in the other two areas. So, revealed, the British academics defending Hamas. Jewish students report feeling unsafe on campus, and I do not blame them. It is crazy how pro-Palestine campuses are these days. British academics have been accused of justifying the attacks by Hamas militants on civilians in online posts. Again, as my criticism with the BBC goes, it's the same here. I don't know why they don't call them terrorists, including one that said the killings were a consequence for partying on stolen land. I think this is the craziest part about not calling them terrorists. They will do absolutely everything else to describe them as terrorists, and obviously imply that they're evil by having an entire article saying, look at all the people who support the terrorists, and then not even use the word terrorist. Look, at this point, the BBC isn't worth following. Just call them terrorists. It's a reflection of reality. The Union of Jewish Students said the statements had contributed to a hostile environment for Jewish students on campuses in the UK. University College London confirmed that it was investigating an academic for reposting a comment made on October 7 saying that Palestine retaliation had been entirely justified. We strongly condemn any form of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, discrimination, incitement, abuse, bullying or harassment, the university said in a statement. We are investigating this incident and will take appropriate action as necessary. Universities have chosen not to single out Hamas for condemnation and have defended their staff's rights for freedom of expression, but Jewish groups demanded that university heads take action, arguing that professors' online activity was bolstering anti-Semitism on campus. And I do find it kind of amazing that universities say that they want to defend freedom of expression when they've been constantly kicking out people for naughty opinions, allowing deplatforming at their universities. It's just mealy-mouthed weaseling, isn't it? We won't defend anyone else's free speech, but when it comes to defending Hamas, yes, that's fine. It's amazing. The universities really need an entirely decade-long investigation into, one, who's in there that is actively against any sort of British values, or in there supporting enemies of Britain, which Hamas is, hence it's a terrorist organisation, who's in there helping coordinate deplatforming, things like that, and which postmodern neo-Marxists do we need to get out of there? And also, of course, investigate into how this all happened in the first place. Tamar Blumgart, 20, a first-year law student at London School of Economics, said that online posts by lecturers at a university had made her feel unsafe on campus, and that friends had removed their Star of David necklaces and kippers. Lecturers promoting these opinions really gives them validity. It's very irresponsible, she said. These posts are added to the hostile environment. The Times has identified a dozen academics at Oxbridge and Russell Group universities who have posted statements appearing to justify the weekend's attack on Israel. Again, as I said before, by the way, they will constantly imply that it was a terrorist attack and then never use the term terrorist attack. It's incredible. Professor Ashkos Kumar, a senior lecturer of political economy at Birkbeck, wrote in a post on Twitter that has now been deleted. Sometimes partying on stolen land next to a concentration camp where 1 million people are starved has consequences. Neil Thin, an honorary fellow at University of Edinburgh, said in a reply, "It looks horribly like gleeful support of a genocidal massacre of hundreds of innocent youngsters by a terrorist organisation who are self-proclaimed anti-Semitic racists." Which is true. Dr. Mariam Aldazari, a senior lecturer at Royal Holloway, part of the University of London, shared an image of a Palestine paraglider and asked why the attack on a desert rave was defined as terrorism rather than self-defence. Paragliders were used by armed Hamas militants to attack the Supernova Festival held near the border with Gaza in the Negev Desert from the air early on Saturday morning. Yes, these are senior fellows, lecturers and all that who are all pro-Hamas. They want to see more of this pure evil. These terrorist supporters are infested everywhere. They're all over academia, as Dominic Cummings said, and if you want to read more examples of senior lecturers in Russell Group University saying Hamas are good actually, then by all means read the article. But as you can probably guess, it is not just the senior lecturers who are like this. The woman who made this speech at Brighton...
For me, yesterday was a victory. As a Palestinian, yesterday was a victory.
Yeah, according to the Times, this was Hanin Barghouti, the women's officer at Sussex University Student Union, and it wasn't just an isolated student union officer who was condoning the attacks. Apparently left-wing societies all over British universities were condoning attacks by Hamas, despite Suella Braverman warning that support for the banned terrorist groups would be punished. She also said that she expects the police to use the full force of the law against anyone displaying support for Hamas following the bloody scenes on Saturday, as they absolutely should be. I unironically want to see mass arrests of these academics and of these students. If they turn out to be foreign, just deport them. And I know all week we've been hearing news about jails being filled. I am more than happy for a huge maximum security one to be built somewhere in the ocean to house all the very worst criminals. That should fill up quite a few spaces. Because we cannot have terrorist sympathisers living among us, whether they are homegrown or whether they are foreign. We go on about British values all the time. I don't see how supporting terrorism is a British value. And unfortunately, it's not just academia that seems to have this problem. Many other British institutions seem to be open to having Hamas supporters either as guests or the institutions themselves harbouring many Hamas supporters. Revealed, brothers friendly to Hamas were Met guests. As Israel goes to war with Palestinian groups, we reveal its connections to the capital's Muslim community. The head of a Middle Eastern school where children are encouraged to draw pictures of Palestinian missiles and Israeli flags on fire has been welcomed to Scotland Yard as a faith representative by Britain's top policeman, Sir Mark Rowley. An investigation by the Times has discovered that Kamal Kozbar, a local councillor for the religious party in Lebanon, was part of a delegation that was invited to advise the police on London's Muslim communities. A Hamas representative attended the graduation ceremony of pupils at his school. In addition, his brother, Mohammed Kozbar, 57, posed for a photograph with Britain's head of counter-terrorism, Matt Jukes, despite having previously supported the founder and leaders of Hamas. In other words, Britain's head of counter-terrorism has shaken hands with a terrorist supporter. These are scenes that didn't even make it into the thick of it. Now a banned terrorist organisation in Britain, Hamas fired thousands of rockets at Israeli villages and towns this weekend, in an assault that has killed hundreds of Israelis. Now, again, in terms of Sir Mark Rowley and Matt Jukes, their head counter-terrorism, it is perfectly reasonable that these two did not know about their connections to Hamas. However, the people organising these events either didn't do their due diligence and look into that sort of thing, or they did know and covered it up, and they wanted these people there as part of the groups advising the Met Police how to deal with Muslim communities because, frankly, they're terrorist supporters. Now, given how many people probably are involved in inviting people, there's probably a mixture there. But the fact of the matter is that means that the Met Police have people in their administration who are either terrorist sympathisers or so incompetent they can't tell when they've invited terrorist sympathisers to meet the heads of the Met Police. And either way, that is an awful state of things when it comes to the Met Police in London. And as you read on, you realise more and more that it is not just incompetence that caused this. Police were warned against engagement with Mohammed, who runs Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, by Sir William Shawcross, a former Charity Commission boss, in his review of the counter-extremism programme Prevent in February. So a reviewer of the Prevent programme, who was a former Charity Commission boss, i.e. someone who knows his onions on this topic, literally told the police, right, don't engage with him, he's a terrorist sympathiser. The police knew that and still went ahead with it anyway. Shawcross said it was inappropriate and counterproductive for national and local police authorities to engage in activity that affords credibility to actors of extremist concern. Mohammed told The Times he rejected any insinuation of extremism. Well, if you support a terrorist organisation, you're an extremist by definition. Mohammed has posted a photograph of himself visiting the grave of the founder of Hamas who was assassinated by Israel in 2004. Mohammed wrote on Facebook, Allah's generosity allows me to visit the Martyrs Cemetery, where the bodies of the master of the resistance martyrs, Mahujid Sika Ahmed Yassin, and his companions lie. It was an unforgettably prestigious visit to one of the nation's greatest. Mohammed has also been photographed with Hamas leaders. And then he's ended up all over London institutions in the Met, with the head of counter-terrorism, and even with Sadiq Khan. Now, again, given that a former Charity Commission boss and expert in the Prevent programme literally said, don't involve this man in anything, he is an extremist, then you've got to start thinking this can't just be down to incompetence. There is malice here. There is malice all over the institutions, unfortunately, because the rot sets deep. Then the next story, NHS doctor mocks Israeli festival goers fleeing Hamas gunmen in social media posts saying, if it was your home, you would stay and fight, you wouldn't just run away. Says someone who clearly has not been on the receiving side of gunfire before. Dr. Mena Elwan said, if it was your home, you would stay and fight in response to horrifying footage of Palestinian terrorists opening fire on innocent partygoers who gathered for an all-night trance music rave. The neurology registrar also claimed there are no civilians in Israel in her series of abhorrent posts on Twitter. Comments by Dr. Elwin, who was last week attended a British Medical Association rally in Manchester, show support for the brutal series of surprise attacks in Israel by Hamas. More than 700 Israeli soldiers and civilians, including 260 slaughtered at the same music festival Dr. Elwin posted footage of, have been killed. BMA bosses said her opinions do not reflect its values and told Mail Online that it will be investigating her post. Dr. Elwin's employer, the Walton Centre, a major neurology site in Liverpool, said it did not support any behaviour that marginalises an individual or community. One thing you have to realise about things like that, especially with the academia and anyone else posting things like this on Twitter, the reason why you would say something that is obviously just so incredibly evil onto Twitter or anywhere in public is because you are surrounded and in an institution, or social circles for that matter, that practically agree with you. You don't say things like this with your name and face to it if you think that it will get you in any trouble. Basically what I'm saying is that in academia and apparently in the NHS, there will be a culture that is effectively either anti-Israeli or pro-Hamas or, just for the lack of a better term, woke. Because it's all the wokies, specifically non-Jewish wokies, who are mostly on the side of Hamas here. And if they're not saying anything in support of Hamas, they're not saying anything at all, like over at the BBC. And you just have to start asking yourself, why is it that the places with all of this wokery, where everyone has a problem with the way they are institutionally run, why are they the ones always seen with Hamas supporters? Why are they the ones always with people in there who are happy to gloat about a quote-unquote victory that included the murder of hundreds of innocent Israeli civilians? And the thing is, it's spilling out even further. It's not just the classic institutions. Football has apparently been completely taken over by it. Wembley Stadium Arch won't be lit in Israel's colours, as flag and kits are also restricted. Like, it's crazy. Football is usually one of the wokest places known to the British public. They're still kneeling before matches for Black Lives Matter. They virtue signal as much as they can. Wembley's arches have always been lit up in light of attacks. They lit them up in the colour of France when France got attacked by terrorists. Naturally, here's a picture of them lighting up in the Ukrainian colours post-Ukraine being invaded. They always try and show their support for things like this, but in this case, nothing. And this is their excuse. The Wembley Stadium arch will not be lit in the blue and white of the Israeli flag. The Football Association says that instead England and Australia will play wearing black armbands during their friendly at Wembley on Friday night, which is kind of the consolation prize of having respect shown to you, I suppose. A period of silence will also be held before kick-off. In a statement, the FA said that it remembers the innocent victims of the devastating events in Israel and Palestine. Our thoughts are with them and their families and friends in England and Australia, and with all communities who are affected by this ongoing conflict. We stand for humanity and an end to the death, violence, fear and suffering. Now, I'm not saying they should be forced to virtue signal in this way. In fact, I wouldn't usually really care one way or the other. But it is a deafening silence that an industry that is more and more getting Arab money, and who usually shows solidarity after the events of invasions or terrorist attacks, aren't doing so in the same way here. It just goes to show how pro-Islamist the UK is becoming. And that's not to mention all the marches we've been seeing throughout all the major cities in Britain. I mean, the pro-Palestine march in Sheffield saw these scenes recently as well.
Take it down! Take it down! Take it down!
I mean, if that's not scenes of an ethnic conflict overspilling into Britain, I don't know what is. But as I say, this probably wouldn't be a massive issue if we actually had British ideologues in our British institutions who would go out and mass arrest this crowd, who are quite clearly willing to go outside the realms of peaceful protest by trespassing onto the roof of Sheffield's town hall and then throwing the Israeli flag to the ground to replace it with the Palestinian one. And we're seeing similar, though not quite as extreme, scenes throughout the cities of Britain, as I showed in the last video and as have continued since. And will continue since, because we have such a large cohort of foreigners who are openly pro-Islamist. You can't have a society like that. And the point of this video is to show that, unfortunately, that ideological view has become either passively accepted or is actively being pushed in major British institutions, whether they be academia, the BBC, the NHS, the Met Police, and of course, let's not forget the Labour Party. Let's not forget that a majority of the Shadow Cabinet, Keir Starmer's Shadow Cabinet and Keir Starmer himself, were fully behind Jeremy Corbyn's Labour. Jeremy Corbyn, who of course is also a friend of Hamas. If you are this passive about someone's support for Hamas that you will stick within your party despite being, quite frankly, being headed by a pro-terrorist, then there is clearly something deeply disturbing going on throughout our institutions. And Dominic Cummings, having been at the head of one of our institutions, clearly he knows that there are many Navarro media types throughout academia, throughout the BBC and throughout Whitehall. And I hope from today you can see that it does indeed range from passive acceptance of support for Hamas to outright support for Hamas. Obviously for the BBC that's quite hard to do because the BBC appears to be actually relatively good at hiding these terrorist sympathies, but academia has done a god-awful job. And for the rest of our institutions, I mean, it's just all over the place really, isn't it? Absolutely filled to the brim with leftists, and these leftists are apparently perfectly fine with terrorism against Israel. So with that, that's everything I had for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.